How can a chapter that takes less than a minute to recite contain an entire philosophy of consciousness? This question becomes especially intriguing when we consider the role of al-Fatiha in daily Islamic practice. It is recited multiple times during prayer every single day. For many believers, it is the most familiar passage in the Quran yet. Familiarity does not necessarily produce understanding. Repetition often becomes mechanical. A mechanical repetition rarely leads to deep cognitive transformation. However, certain classical thinkers approached this chapter differently. Among them was the Andalusian mystic and philosopher Ibn Arabi, who argued that al-Fatiha is far more than an introductory prayer. In his view, it represents a condensed map of human consciousness. According to his interpretation, the chapter encodes a psychological progression. Each verse guides the mind through a shift in perception from ego-centered thinking toward a broader awareness of reality. This lecture explores that idea in analytical terms, rather than treating al-Fatiha solely as devotional text. We will examine how its structure can function as a process of cognitive and emotional recalibration. To understand why this interpretation matters, we must first consider a central problem of modern psychology: the fragmentation of human attention. In contemporary life, individuals are exposed to constant streams of information, notifications, social media feeds, rapid news cycles, and multitasking environments create continuous cognitive stimulation. Neuroscientists often describe the result as attention fragmentation, a state in which the mind struggles to maintain sustained focus on a single framework of meaning. This fragmentation produces several psychological consequences. First, it contributes to chronic distraction. The brain shifts rapidly between stimuli, preventing deep processing. Second, it generates emotional overload. When attention jumps constantly between threats, opportunities, and social comparisons, the brain remains in a state of elevated alertness. From a neuroscientific perspective, this pattern keeps the sympathetic nervous system active. The body remains in a mild but persistent stress response. A third consequence is the loss of existential orientation. Without a stable narrative that organizes experience, many individuals report a vague sense of meaninglessness or identity instability. In other words, the modern mind often lacks a coherent structure that integrates perception, emotion, and purpose. This is precisely where thinkers like Ibn Arabi located the significance of al-Fatiha. He interpreted it as a structured narrative, capable of organizing consciousness itself. To appreciate this interpretation, it is helpful to briefly examine the intellectual framework of Ibn Arabi. Born in 1165 in the region of Andalusia, Ibn Arabi became one of the most influential philosophers of Islamic spirituality. His works, particularly Futuhat al-Makkiyya and Futuhat al-Hikam, explore complex ideas about perception, reality, and the relationship between human consciousness and the divine. One of his most important concepts is the role of the heart, or qalb, but in ordinary language, the heart is associated with emotion. But in Ibn Arabi's philosophy, the heart functions as a perceptual organ. It is a center of awareness capable of recognizing patterns of meaning that the analytical intellect alone cannot grasp. From this perspective, spiritual texts are not merely informational. They act as cognitive architecture structures that reorganize perception itself. Ibn Arabi believed that repeated engagement with sacred language gradually reshapes how individuals interpret reality. In this sense, recitation functions similarly to cognitive training. He interpreted al-Fatiha as a sequence of 7 conceptual movements. Each verse performs a specific psychological function, guiding the mind toward a balanced and coherent orientation. The first function of al-Fatiha involves the redirection of attention in cognitive science. Attention is one of the most powerful determinants of perception. The aspects of reality that individuals focus on become the aspects they interpret most strongly. Human attention naturally develops biases. Psychologists refer to these patterns as attention biases. The brain tends to prioritize information related to threats, status competition, or self-preservation, while these biases once served evolutionary purposes. They can also produce chronic stress. When attention repeatedly focuses on potential problems, the mind becomes trapped in cycles of rumination. The opening orientation of al-Fatiha interrupts this pattern. Rather than beginning with personal concerns, the chapter directs awareness toward a universal reference point. In psychological terms, this shift moves attention away from narrow self-focus and toward a broader framework of meaning. Similar mechanisms appear in certain forms of mindfulness meditation, where practitioners redirect attention towards stable objects such as breath or sensory awareness. Ibn Arabi interpreted this opening as attentional realignment before addressing personal needs or anxieties. The mind establishes a wider perspective on reality. The next conceptual movement in al-Fatiha centers on praise and recognition of divine mercy. From a modern psychological standpoint, this corresponds closely with the function of gratitude. Over the past 2 decades, research in positive psychology has repeatedly demonstrated that gratitude practices produce measurable benefits. These include improved emotional resilience, reduced symptoms of depression, and even better sleep quality. Neuroscientific studies show that experiences of gratitude activate brain regions associated with reward processing, including systems linked to dopamine and serotonin release. But Ibn Arabi's interpretation suggests an even deeper function. Praise, in this framework, is not intended to flatter God. Instead, it restructures how the individual perceives reality. When attention is trained to recognize sources of mercy and death, support, emotional interpretation changes. Events that previously appeared purely negative may be viewed within a broader context of meaning. Consider a simple example. 2 individuals may encounter the same professional setback. One interprets it exclusively as failure. The other interprets it as part of a larger process of growth. The external situation remains identical, but the emotional experience differs dramatically. Al-Fatiha systematically trains the mind toward this second mode of interpretation, one grounded in recognition rather than complaint. A central verse of Al-Fatiha expresses a principle of reliance on God. This idea has often been interpreted purely in theological terms, but it also has significant psychological implications. Modern psychology has identified a phenomenon known as the illusion of control. Individuals frequently assume they must manage every variable affecting their lives. While personal responsibility is important, Excessive control, expectations can create severe mental strain. People may feel personally responsible for outcomes that are largely determined by external factors. This dynamic often leads to anxiety, burnout, and chronic stress. Ibn Arabi's interpretation introduces an alternative perspective, recognizing dependence on a higher order does not eliminate human effort. Rather, it recalibrates the balance between effort and acceptance. In contemporary psychology, a similar balance appears in discussions of locus of control. Individuals with a healthy psychological outlook typically maintain both internal responsibility and acceptance of uncertainty. Al-Fatiha guides the mind toward exactly this balance. Human agency remains meaningful, but ultimate control is not attributed to the individual alone. The result is a reduction in psychological overload. The final movement of Al-Fatiha culminates in a request for guidance along a straight path. From the standpoint of cognitive psychology, this corresponds to goal-directed cognition. Human beings function best when their actions are organized around coherent goals, without clear direction. The mind experiences confusion, decision fatigue, and motivational instability, Ibn Arabi interpreted this final request as a declaration of intellectual humility. Instead of assuming complete knowledge, the individual acknowledges the need for guidance and continuous learning. This mindset aligns closely with modern research on growth-oriented thinking. Individuals who view life as an ongoing learning process tend to demonstrate greater resilience. In the face of challenges, the closing verses of Al-Fatiha therefore transform the entire prayer into a cognitive orientation toward purposeful development, rather than presenting a static belief system. The chapter frames life as a guided journey, requiring ongoing awareness and adaptation. One question remains: why must this chapter be repeated so frequently? From a neuroscientific perspective, repetition plays a crucial role in neuroplasticity. The brain strengthens neural pathways through repeated activation. Practices performed consistently over time gradually shape cognitive habits. This is why daily routines from exercise to language learning can produce long-term psychological change. Ibn Arabi interpreted the repetition of Al-Fatiha in a similar way. Each recitation reinforces a set of mental orientations: attentional focus, gratitude, humility, and purposeful direction. However, he also warned against purely mechanical repetition without conscious awareness. The cognitive restructuring process becomes weaker. The words may be spoken, but their psychological function remains inactive. When recitation occurs with attention and understanding, the chapter becomes something more than ritual. It becomes a daily system of cognitive training. If this interpretation is taken seriously, it suggests a practical method for engaging with Al-Fatiha more intentionally. The first step is slow recitation. Rather than rushing through the chapter, the reader allows each phrase to be mentally processed. The second step involves conceptual awareness. Each verse corresponds to a stage in the cognitive progression: orientation toward reality, gratitude, reliance, and guidance. The third step is emotional alignment. Instead of merely understanding the concepts intellectually, the individual allows them to influence emotional perception. A fourth step involves attention training. When the mind begins to wander, common occurrence during repeated practices, the reader gently returns attention to the meaning of the words. Finally, the insights of the chapter can be integrated into daily decision-making. Gratitude may guide responses to difficulty, humility may moderate success, and the search for guidance may shape long-term goals. In this way, the chapter moves beyond ritual, recitation, and becomes an ongoing cognitive framework. According to Ibn Arabi, Al-Fatiha is not simply an introductory passage to the Quran. It is a carefully structured architecture of consciousness. Through 7 concise verses, it guides the mind through several psychological transformations: the redirection of attention, the cultivation of gratitude, the balance between effort and surrender, and the search for guidance, viewed through a modern lens. The chapter functions as a form of daily cognitive reset, an opportunity to realign perception, emotion, and purpose. The deeper insight offered by Ibn Arabi is that spiritual texts are not merely sources of information, they are tools for reorganizing awareness itself. And when perception, attention, and meaning become aligned, the human heart, understood as the center of awareness, begins to open.